Hey everyone, I'm back with a question about power consumption. I was presented with the question of how much a particular electrical build would consume power-wise, and thought that was a very interesting question because I've never actually measured what all these components consume. If you've used electricity at all, you've noticed that even switches and other things all seem to consume some amount of power, but there's really no guide to that, at least that I've seen yet, so I thought it would be interesting exercise to go through and measure the power consumption of all the different components by not just testing one, but testing a series of all the components to make sure that if they're not quite a rounds number, we can factor out the rounding error and figure out what's going on here. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a power input that's relatively high, and I'm using a branch to cut it down to 50 units of power going out. And you can see here there's 50 coming into this counter. I have all these counters set to display mode, and this is a very nice visual example of how much power each of these consumes. They each consume 1. They're showing you their output power. So this guy gets 50, consumes 1, and outputs 49. This guy inputs 49, consumes 1, outputs 48, and they're showing you what they're outputting. So whenever you're looking at a display, you're actually seeing the amount of power coming in minus 1, minus its own power consumption. So, of course, across this we drop from 50 to 40 because each of these guys consumes 1 unit of power. I'm going to repeat this exercise with all the other components that are available and try to get a good idea of what each possible component consumes so that when you're trying to design a base, if you're trying to fit in with a certain power load or restriction of amount of power that you have available, you could actually count it all up and do the math in advance to make sure you're not exceeding your available power load. So this should get interesting. I'm going to just actually keep recording this video and just go through all these, but this is probably going to take a while. So what you're going to see is most likely something I run through post-production and do a bunch of time acceleration and editing to make this a little more reasonable. So it looks like on splitters, you lose 1 additional unit of power when you're splitting. So if you're just going straight through, you lose 1 unit of power for the splitter. But if you're splitting on 2 or 3 outputs, you actually lose 2 units of power. So that's an interesting thing. So that answers the question. Blockers consume 1 unit of power, and the block pass-through port also consumes 1 unit of power. And these splitters, despite the fact that the counters showed them consuming 2 when they were fully loaded, they're effectively only consuming 1 in a configuration like this. So sounds like your mileage may vary depending on how you're using these splitters. If you want to be safe, you better count splitters as 2 when you're fully loading them, but it looks like effectively you can treat them as 1 and still get away with it. All right, so that answers that question. Branches take 3 power. The 2 they are branching off and the 1 that they use for themselves to operate. Root combiners do not consume power. Very interesting, right? Interesting anomaly on the memory cell. Does not consume power itself, but its reset and its set buttons do consume power. They consume 1 unit. So when you're calculating out using memory cells, apparently they don't take any power away from your circuit, but you do need at least 1 unit of power to activate their set or reset. Switches consume 1 unit of power. Now, if you've watched my other videos, you'll know that the switches do not cause batteries to turn on. Timers consume 1 unit of power when they're on, and their toggle inputs consume 1 unit of power when they are on. And be careful that the timer or power before a timer is on before you try to trigger a timer's toggle, otherwise it won't work. $40. Or switches use 1 unit of power. I bet you're all shocked. Bottom line is, XOR switches do not consume power. And switches, when you turn them on, consume no power. So interesting, just like an XOR switch, they do not consume a unit of power themselves. Its input is 50. Its output, when I'm not standing on, is 0. When output when I am standing on it is 49. Gonna bring in 50 power to its input. Power out 0. Block it. Power out's 49. This would be 48 when it consumes its unit, but laser also uses 1 unit of power. Ta-da! They all consume 1 unit of power. Door controllers take 1 unit of power just to turn them on sitting by themselves unlinked to a door, but when linked to a door, all you have to do is apply power to them, and they do not consume that unit of power. So that's interesting. Counter consumes 1. As a display, it consumes 1. Its increment input consumes 1. Its decrement input consumes 1. And its clear input consumes 1. Now, I believe I have tested all of the different inputs and all the different components that consume power to see which ones consume and which ones do not and how much they consume. Again, I will put up a long form of this, probably. Probably not the same time as the short version, but because it'll take longer for it to render and output. But if you're watching the short version here, then you got all the summary. And I think at the end, I'm going to throw up a little spreadsheet that just summarizes all these as well. So look forward to that. And that, hopefully, is that until later.